So, what really happens after we die? The Bible actually lays out a surprisingly detailed journey for the soul. But let's be honest, terms like Hades, Sheol, and Hell, they get thrown around a lot and cause a ton of confusion. In this explainer, we're going to map out that entire journey, step by step, from the moment of death all the way to its final eternal destination. Okay, let's dive right into the big question. It's probably the most common point of confusion, right? We hear these terms and often think they're all just different names for the same fiery place. But are they? The source material says no, not at all. To really get it, you have to stop thinking of them as just one location and start seeing them as different stops on a timeline. So, let's start building that timeline. We're going to begin with a high-level roadmap that outlines the 5 key stages every single soul is said to go through. Getting this framework down is absolutely essential to understanding where all the pieces fit. Here it is, the universal pathway that the biblical texts seem to lay out. It all starts with physical death, of course. But that's not the end of the story. It's the beginning of a process. Next is a temporary waiting state, then comes a resurrection, which is followed by a final judgment. It's only after all of that happens that a soul enters its permanent eternal state. You see, understanding this sequence is the key to unlocking the whole puzzle. All right, so let's take our first step on that path, the waiting place. What happens in those moments right after death? Well, the scripture suggests the soul immediately goes to an intermediate state, kind of a holding area. But, and this is a huge but, as we're about to see, this waiting room has 2 very, very different sides. Now, this is where it gets really interesting, especially in the parable from Luke 16. It shows a clear division. On one side, you have paradise, which is also called Abraham's bosom, a place of comfort for the righteous. And on the other side, you've got Hades, a place of torment for the unrighteous. The crucial thing to remember here is that both of these are temporary holding places. So, who was on that comfort site in paradise? Well, the texts point to righteous figures from the Old Testament, people like Abraham himself, the father of faith, who's mentioned by name in that Luke 16 story. You also have figures like King David, who was called a man after God's own heart, and prophets like Daniel. These were souls waiting, but waiting in comfort. And in Hades, the classic example, of course, is the rich man from that same story in Luke 16, the one who ignored the poor man at his gate and found himself in torment. Other figures said to be here include King Saul, who directly disobeyed God, and even Judas Iscariot, who betrayed Jesus. These souls are also waiting, but their wait is described as a state of suffering. So once that waiting period is over, the next major event on our roadmap is the resurrection. But here's a critical detail that a lot of people miss. The Bible doesn't really talk about one single resurrection for everybody. Instead, it points to 2 totally distinct resurrections for 2 different groups of people happening at 2 different times. So the first resurrection is called the resurrection of life, and it is exclusively for the saved. What's more, it's not a single event, but happens in phases. It actually begins with Christ himself. In 1 Corinthians 15, he's called the first fruits, which is a great analogy. He was the first of the harvest, the absolute guarantee that more would follow. This resurrection then continues with believers, like you see described in 1 Thessalonians 4. Then, much later, comes the second resurrection. This one is called the resurrection of judgment. According to Revelation chapter 20, this is the moment when all the unsaved dead who have been waiting in Hades are raised. Why? To stand before what's called the Great White Throne for their final individual judgment. And that judgment brings us to the final stop on our journey, permanent eternity. After the resurrections and judgments are all done, those temporary waiting places, paradise and Hades, they're just not needed anymore. At this point, every soul finally enters their final, unchangeable, eternal destination. And here they are, the 2 final eternal destinies. For the saved, it's the new heaven and the new earth, which Revelation 21 describes as a place where God literally lives with humanity. For the unsaved, the final destination is the lake of fire, a state that Revelation 20 calls, quite ominously, the second death. Okay, now that we've walked through the whole journey, let's circle back and really zero in on those terms that cause all the confusion. We're going to clearly define the difference between Hades, the lake of fire, and another place you might have heard of, Tartarus. All right, first things first, let's just take Tartarus completely off the table for humans. According to 2 Peter 2:4, this is a unique, deep prison, and it's reserved exclusively for a very specific group of fallen angels who sinned way back before the flood. It is never,
ever described as a place for human souls. So it's a totally separate issue from the human journey we've been mapping out.
This table right here clarifies the most important distinction for people. You've got Hades, and its Old Testament equivalent, Sheol, which is a temporary holding place for unsaved human souls awaiting judgment. Then you have the Lake of Fire, also called Gehenna, which is the permanent place of punishment after that judgment has happened. Honestly, this analogy from the source material just perfectly nails the concept. Think of Hades as the holding cell or the courtroom where you're waiting for your trial. The Lake of Fire is the prison you're sent to after the final sentence has been handed down. See the difference? One is temporary and transitional, the other is permanent and final. So look, if you take only one thing away from this whole explainer, please let it be this. Understanding the biblical view of the afterlife is all about understanding the difference between temporary and permanent. Hades and Paradise were temporary waiting realms. The Lake of Fire and the New Heaven, those are permanent, eternal realities. So we've traced the soul's path all the way from a temporary waiting place to a permanent eternity. And that leaves us with one final, pretty crucial question to think about. When we stop seeing the afterlife as just a single instantaneous event, and instead view it as a process, a whole journey with distinct stages, how does that change our perspective on life, death, and whatever comes next?